The dining room had gone quiet, in a way that felt heavier than silence usually feels. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears instead of just filling them. And I was still holding the folded paper in my hand when my daughter-in-law's face lost every ounce of color it had. She had asked for this. She had demanded it, actually. Right there in front of my son. In front of her own mother. In front of the good china I'd pulled out for a dinner I now understood had never really been about dinner at all. "This house needs my mother's name on it now," she had said. Not as a question, not as a request, but as an announcement. The kind you make when you've already decided the outcome, and you're only informing the room out of courtesy. I hadn't argued. I hadn't raised my voice, or pushed back my chair, or done any of the things she was probably expecting, maybe even hoping for. Because a woman who raises her voice can be dismissed as emotional, and I had learned a long time ago that calm is a weapon nobody sees coming until it's already landed. I had simply reached into my bag, pulled out the original deed to the house I had built with 29 years of overtime shifts and missed birthdays and payments that never once came late. And I had asked her, very gently, to read the bottom line. And that was the moment her face went white, right there at my table, because the name printed at the bottom of that deed was not mine alone, and it was certainly not hers, and it was not her mother's either. It belonged to someone none of them had ever heard me mention in 30 years. And before I tell you what happened after that, before I tell you what she did when she finally understood what she was looking at, I need to take you back to where this whole story actually begins, because none of it makes sense without the woman I used to be, before any of these people ever knew my name. I was 26 years old when I became a widow, and I want to be clear that widow is not a word I use lightly or dramatically, because the truth of it was far less cinematic than the word suggests. There was no long illness, no hospital room, no goodbye. My husband left for a job site on a Tuesday morning in October, and a supervisor called me 4 hours later to tell me there had been an accident. And by the time I hung up the phone, I was a 26-year-old woman with a 2-year-old son asleep in the next room and a mortgage payment due in 11 days that I had no idea how I was going to make. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor that night, not crying, just sitting, staring at the cabinets my husband had installed himself the year before, running my hand along the counter like it might tell me what to do next. Grief has a way of arriving in stages you don't expect, and mine arrived first as panic, cold and practical, because underneath the sorrow was a much louder voice telling me that my son needed a roof over his head in 11 days, and sorrow doesn't pay mortgages. The bank I went to that week looked at me the way banks looked at young widows in those days, which is to say they looked at me like a liability wearing a coat. I had no credit history of my own because everything had been in my husband's name, no cosigner, no family with money to lean on, and a loan officer told me, almost kindly, that there simply wasn't a path forward for someone in my position. I left that office and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home, because I understood in that moment that if I didn't find a way to keep that house, I would lose the last place my son would ever remember his father living in. I tried 2 more banks that same week, sitting in waiting rooms with my son on my lap because I couldn't afford a sitter, rehearsing what I would say as though the right words might finally unlock a different answer. It never did. Each conversation ended the same way, a polite refusal dressed in different language, and by the end of that week, I had started quietly making peace with the idea that my son might grow up somewhere else entirely, with no memory of the man who built the cabinets in our kitchen. I didn't tell anyone how close I had come to giving up, because admitting it out loud felt like it might make the outcome more real than it already was. It was my late husband's old employer, a man named Frank Delaney, who changed the direction of everything. He wasn't family. He wasn't even someone I knew particularly well outside the handful of company picnics I'd attended over the years, holding a paper plate and making small talk with men whose names I mostly forgot by the following week. But when word got around that my husband's widow was about to lose her home, Frank showed up at my door on a Sunday afternoon, uninvited, holding a folder of paperwork he'd already had his lawyer draw up. He told me he'd worked with my husband for 6 years, that my husband had once pulled him out of a dangerous situation on a job site without a second thought for his own safety, and that he wasn't about to let that man's wife and son end up on the street over a mortgage payment. He offered to co-sign the loan, not lend me money outright, which I would have refused out of pride even in my desperation, but to put his name on the paperwork so the bank would approve what they wouldn't approve for me alone. In exchange, he asked for exactly nothing, except that his name remain quietly listed as a co-owner on the deed until the loan was paid off in full, purely as a formality to protect the arrangement, with the understanding, spoken plainly between the two of us at that kitchen table, that the house and everything in it belonged to me and to my son, and that he would never once assert a claim to any of it. I want you to understand what that meant for a woman in my position at that time. It meant I could keep the walls my son had learned to walk between. It meant I didn't have to explain to a 2-year-old, years later, why we didn't live in the house his father built the cabinets in. It meant survival, plain and simple, handed to me by a man who owed me nothing, and asked for nothing in return, except my word that I would work hard and keep my promises, which I did, for 29 years, without missing a single payment, without ever once calling him to ask for more help, without ever telling my son the full story of how close we came to losing everything before he was old enough to remember any of it. I worked 2 jobs for the first 6 years. I cleaned offices at 5 in the morning before switching into a different uniform for a receptionist job that ran until 6 at night, and on weekends I took in ironing and hemming for neighbors who paid me in cash, and sometimes in casseroles when cash was tight for them too. I remember the year my son turned 7 and asked me why I was never home for his birthday parties, and I told him I was building something for him that he wouldn't understand until he was much older, which was true, though at the time it felt like a poor substitute for a mother who could actually be present. There were Christmases where the tree went up 2 weeks late because I was working overtime shifts through December, birthdays celebrated on the following Saturday instead of the actual day, a decade of vacations that never happened, because every extra dollar went toward the principal on that mortgage, instead of toward anything resembling rest. There were harder years too, ones I don't often talk about even now. The year the roof needed replacing, and I took on ironing for 4 families just to cover what insurance wouldn't. The year my son broke his arm, and I sat in the emergency room doing the math between the hospital bill and the mortgage payment due 9 days later, certain for a few sleepless nights I would have to choose between the two. I never had to, not because money appeared from nowhere, but because I picked up a second office to clean on top of the first, coming home smelling of bleach and floor polish, showering before I'd let myself hold my son so it wouldn't cling to his hair at bedtime. Those years taught me exactly how much a person can carry when the alternative is losing the one thing that still felt like home. Frank checked in every so often, never intrusive, always brief. A phone call around the holidays, a card in the mail on my son's birthday for the first several years, a quiet presence in the background of a life he had made possible but never tried to claim credit for. He never remarried, never had children of his own, and I think, looking back now, that the arrangement we'd made meant more to him than either of us said out loud at the time, a way of honoring the man who had once pulled him back from a fall that could have killed him, a debt he chose to repay to a widow and a boy instead of to a ghost. When the mortgage was finally paid off in full, the year my son turned 19, Frank drove out to see me one last time, not to remove his name from the deed, which he insisted on keeping for reasons he never fully explained, but to tell me he was proud of what I'd built, and that the house would always be, in his words, more mine than anyone else's could ever be. He passed away 8 years later, quietly, in his sleep, with no family of his own to notify, and I was the one who arranged the small service that almost nobody attended, because almost nobody else remembered who he was or what he'd done. I never told my son the details. I told him only that an old friend of his father's had helped us through a hard time once, because by then my son was grown, married, building a life of his own, and some kinds of debt and gratitude feel too private, too sacred almost, to hand over as casual family history at a dinner table. My son married 4 years ago, and I liked his wife well enough in the beginning, or told myself I did, which is sometimes the same thing when you want very badly for your child's marriage to succeed. She was polished, capable, the kind of woman who always seemed to know exactly what to say in a room, and for the first year or so, that quality read to me as confidence rather than calculation. It was small things at first, the way she would refer to my house as the family house without ever quite acknowledging whose family had built it, the way she began sitting in on conversations about repairs or property taxes with an authority that felt earned rather than granted. I told myself I was being an overprotective mother, unwilling to share space in my son's affections, the kind of thing older women are so often accused of, and sometimes rightly so. But the shift became harder to explain away over the past year. She started asking questions that weren't really questions, comments dressed up as curiosity, like wondering aloud whether the house was, quote, properly protected for the family's future, or mentioning, almost in passing, that her own mother had extensive experience handling property matters and would be happy to look things over sometime. Her mother, a woman named Diane who I'd met perhaps a dozen times total, began showing up more frequently, always with an opinion about the house, the yard, the arrangement of furniture, speaking about the property with a familiarity that unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite name for months. I noticed a locksmith's van parked outside one afternoon when I came home early from a doctor's appointment, and when I asked my son about it later, he said, a little too quickly, that his wife had wanted new keys made as a precaution, though a precaution against what, nobody explained. I received a voicemail one Tuesday from a notary's office confirming an appointment I had never scheduled, regarding a document I had never seen, related to a property transfer I knew nothing about. I called back 3 times before someone finally explained, apologetically, that they'd been contacted by a woman claiming to be my daughter-in-law, inquiring about the process for adding a name to an existing property deed, and had mistakenly left the confirmation on what they believed was my number instead of hers. That same week, I overheard part of a phone call I wasn't meant to hear, my daughter-in-law's voice drifting from the guest room, telling someone that it was only a matter of time before the old formalities got sorted out, and that her mother deserved something to show for how much she'd invested in this family. I stood in the hallway a long moment, feeling something cold settle in my stomach, not because the words were shocking, but because of how casually they were spoken, as though the house I'd spent 29 years earning was a line item waiting to be reassigned. I didn't confront anyone that day. I simply sat with the information, the way I've learned to sit with things before I act on them, turning it over in my mind while I watered the plants and made dinner and went about my week as though nothing at all had shifted beneath my feet. I pulled the original deed out of the fireproof box in my closet that same evening, read it start to finish for the first time in years, and reminded myself exactly what it said, and exactly what it didn't say, and exactly who it would surprise. She went on, explaining, unprompted, that it only made sense given how involved Diane had become in the family, how it would provide security for everyone moving forward, how she was certain I would understand once I thought it through properly. My son said nothing, looking down at his plate, and Diane sat with her hands folded, watching me with an expression I can only describe as expectant, as though she already knew how this dinner was going to end, and was simply waiting for me to catch up. I worked 2 jobs for the first 6 years. I cleaned offices at 5 in the morning before switching into a different uniform for a receptionist job that ran until 6 at night, and on weekends I took in ironing and hemming for neighbors who paid me in cash and sometimes in casseroles when cash was tight for them too. I remember the year my son turned 7 and asked me why I was never home for his birthday parties, and I told him I was building something for him that he wouldn't understand until he was much older. Which was true, though at the time it felt like a poor substitute for a mother who could actually be present. There were Christmases where the tree went up 2 weeks late because I was working overtime shifts through December, birthdays celebrated on the following Saturday instead of the actual day, a decade of vacations that never happened because every extra dollar went toward the principal on that mortgage instead of toward anything resembling rest. The dinner where everything came to a head wasn't one I planned as a confrontation. It started as an ordinary Sunday meal, my son and his wife, her mother Diane joining us for the first time in months, roast chicken, and the good tablecloth, because it was meant to be a pleasant evening, nothing more. Conversation moved the way it always did. Work updates, weather, a story about a neighbor's new dog, until my daughter-in-law set her fork down with a small, deliberate click against the plate, the kind of sound that tells you a person has been waiting for their moment. "This house needs my mother's name on it now," she said, looking directly at me rather than at my son, her voice pleasant, almost casual, as though she were suggesting we repaint the hallway, rather than restructure ownership of my home. I felt something settle in me in that moment. Not anger exactly, though anger was certainly present somewhere underneath, but something closer to clarity, the kind that comes after you've spent weeks turning a problem over in your mind and finally see the full shape of it laid out in front of you. I thought about 11 days and a mortgage payment I couldn't make. I thought about 5 in the morning and cleaning offices before switching into a receptionist's blouse. I thought about a man named Frank Delaney standing at my door on a Sunday afternoon with a folder of paperwork and nothing to gain. And I thought about the promise I had made him and kept for 29 years without a single missed payment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back my chair. I reached for my bag, sitting on the empty chair beside me, and pulled out a folder I had, if I'm honest, brought with me that evening, half hoping I wouldn't need it, and half knowing that I would. I set the deed on the table, unfolded it carefully, and slid it across the tablecloth toward my daughter-in-law, asking her, quite gently, to read it, and specifically to read the bottom line, where the names of record were listed in plain black ink that had never once changed in 29 years. I watched her eyes move across the page, watched the exact moment her expression shifted from confident to confused, to something else entirely, something that looked almost like fear, though I don't think she could have named it that herself. I set the deed on the table, unfolded it carefully, and slid it across the tablecloth toward my daughter-in-law, asking her, quite gently, to read it, and specifically to read the bottom line, where the names of record were listed in plain black ink that had never once changed in 29 years. I watched her eyes move across the page, watched the exact moment her expression shifted from confident to confused, to something else entirely, something that looked almost like fear, though I don't think she could have named it that herself. "Whose name is this?" she asked, her voice smaller now than it had been 30 seconds earlier, and I told her the truth, plainly, without embellishment, that the second name on that deed belonged to a man named Frank Delaney, my late husband's former employer, who had co-signed the mortgage 29 years ago when no bank in this city would extend credit to a 26-year-old widow with an infant son, and who had passed away 8 years prior, and whose name, under the terms of the original agreement we had made together, could only be removed through a legal process involving his estate. A process that had never been initiated because, quite simply, nobody in that family had ever needed it to be. My son looked up from his plate for the first time since the demand had been made, staring at the paper like he was seeing it for the first time, which, in a sense, he was, because I had never once told him this part of the story either. Diane's hands, which had been folded so calmly a moment before, now sat perfectly still on the table, and I watched her recalculate something behind her eyes, watched her understand, faster than her daughter seemed to, that whatever plan had brought her to my table that evening had just run headlong into a piece of paper 30 years older than the marriage that produced it. My daughter-in-law asked, in a voice considerably less certain than the one she'd used to open the conversation, how she was supposed to add her mother's name if there was already someone else listed, and I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that she wasn't, that the house had never been simply mine to redistribute at a dinner table, that it carried within it a debt and a promise made to a man who was no longer alive to defend either, and that no amount of confidence or family strategy was going to override 30 years of legal and personal history in a single evening. Diane left first, standing abruptly, gathering her purse, muttering something about needing to get home, and my daughter-in-law followed a few minutes later, quieter than I had ever seen her, pausing at the door to look back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. somewhere between embarrassment and something closer to respect, though I won't pretend to know for certain which it was. My son stayed behind after they'd gone, sitting across from me at the table for a long while, the deed still lying open between us, and eventually he asked me why I had never told him, and I told him the truth, that some kinds of survival don't need an audience, that I had never wanted him to grow up feeling like a debt he had to repay, only a boy who was loved and provided for, and that the details of how difficult that provision had been were mine to carry, not his. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had ever filled that room before, heavier, more complete, the kind that makes you aware of the sound of your own breathing. My son finally spoke, asking quietly who Frank Delaney was, and I found myself, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, telling the whole story out loud. Not the shortened version I'd given him as a teenager, but the full account, the bank that turned me away, the Sunday afternoon knock on the door, the folder of paperwork, the promise kept without complaint for 29 years because a stranger's kindness had asked for nothing in return, except that I honor it. I watched my son's face change as I spoke, watched him understand for the first time exactly what his childhood had rested on, exactly how close it had come to looking entirely different. And I watched something in him soften toward the mother who had never once thought to burden him with any of it. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking often about Frank, about the particular kind of courage it takes to offer something to a stranger, with no expectation of ever being repaid, and about how differently that instinct had shown up in the people now circling my table. He never once asked what was in it for him, never used it as leverage, never treated a widow's gratitude as a debt to be collected. I wondered what it might have looked like if my daughter-in-law's family had approached me the way Frank once did, asking rather than assuming, offering rather than demanding. I think the outcome might have been entirely different, if only they had asked instead of announced. Things changed slowly after that dinner, not dramatically, not with apologies delivered in grand speeches, but in smaller ways that mattered more. My daughter-in-law stopped referring to the house as the family house in that particular tone she used to use, the one that implied ownership without ever saying the word. Diane stopped appearing quite so often, and when she did, the conversation no longer circled back to property or protection or the future in ways that felt engineered. My son began asking me questions he'd never asked before, about his father, about those early years, about the parts of my life I had folded away and never quite unfolded for him, and I found myself, for the first time in a long time, telling those stories not out of necessity, but because someone finally wanted to hear them. People sometimes ask me why I didn't simply refuse my daughter-in-law outright that evening, why I let the moment build the way it did, instead of shutting it down the second the demand left her mouth. And I tell them the truth, which is that some lessons land harder when a person discovers them for themselves rather than being told. She didn't need me to argue with her. She needed to read that name on the bottom of that page and understand, in the space of a single sentence, that the ground she thought she was standing on had never been hers to claim in the first place. I built that house one overtime shift at a time, one missed birthday at a time, one payment made on time out of 29 years of payments, and I did it because a man named Frank Delaney believed a young widow deserved a chance nobody else was willing to give her. I still have the deed. I keep it in the same fireproof box, in the same closet, though I've since begun the process, quietly, with a lawyer, of formally transferring Frank's portion of the property into a trust that will one day pass to my grandchildren, the ones my son and his wife are hoping to have, ensuring that no single person, no matter how confident or how certain they feel at any given dinner table, will ever again be able to walk into my home and announce a change to something they never had to build. I think about Frank often, more often now than I have in years, about a man who knocked on a stranger's door with nothing to gain and asked for nothing beyond a promise kept. And I think about the strange, quiet way that kindness outlives the people who offer it, waiting patiently in a folder of old paperwork for exactly the moment it's needed most. Some debts you repay in dollars, and some you repay by keeping a promise for the rest of your life, quietly, without needing anyone else to know the story until the moment they finally need to hear it. I think, too, about how easily that whole evening could have gone differently. If I hadn't kept the deed in a fireproof box, if I hadn't taken a moment weeks earlier to read it, start to finish and remind myself exactly what it said, if I had let panic or anger speak for me instead of patience. There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need to raise its voice or slam a door or deliver a speech. And I think that is the strength Frank Delaney tried to teach me, even if neither of us ever called it a lesson at the time. He simply showed me once what it looked like to do the right thing quietly and let the results speak on their own timeline. I have tried, in the years since, to do the same, to let calm carry more weight than confrontation ever could. And on that particular Sunday evening, at my own table, with the good china still out and the roast chicken going cold, it finally did. My son and I are closer now than we have been in years, not because of what happened at that dinner exactly, but because of everything the dinner finally allowed us to say out loud to each other. My daughter-in-law and I have found a slower, more careful kind of peace, one built less on affection than on a mutual understanding of where the boundaries actually sit, which, in its own way, is its own kind of progress. Diane and I have not spoken since, and I suspect we may never need to. And the house still stands the way it always has. Paid for. Protected. Carrying within its walls 29 years of overtime shifts, and missed birthdays, and one stranger's quiet, unasked for kindness. Waiting, if it ever needs to again, to remind anyone who forgets exactly whose name was written there first, and exactly what it took to keep it that way.